God sees to it that Ahithophel's advice is disregarded. And here is the comment, one of the very few comments that we have in the book of Samuel, so that we can know what God is actually thinking. The Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. God is just reminding us, this conflict is not just between political powers. This conflict is between those who are on God's side and those who are not. And God has determined to bring disaster on Absalom. God has acted, and God's going to continue to act in this whole thing. David's espionage ring at this point comes into being. They start sending him advice. They start finding out what's going on. They're serving him. They're serving David. They manage to divert attention away, and they successfully reach David that Absalom is not coming after him. He doesn't need to prepare right then. He can have some time, and so he crosses the Jordan, and he gets away cleanly, and nobody comes after him. In the meantime, Ahithophel realizes that if David doesn't die immediately, he's going to be dead sooner or later. And rather than be put to a horrible death by David's men, he goes home and he kills himself. Matthew picks that up. And there's a lot of similarities between the death of Ahithophel, who killed himself, and Judas, who killed himself. The other half of the centerpiece of this section is the disaster that happens to Absalom's forces. They are utterly routed. The war to determine who's going to be king in Jerusalem only lasts one day. But the author has much more interest in the people. He is much more interested in the gruesome details of Absalom's death and David's reaction than he is in any of this battle. He doesn't say how they won the war. The battle took place on the east side of the Jordan River, south and east of that dot up there. That's where Absalom rallied his men to fight. And they fought in those hills, in this forest. But first, David is met by these friendly local authorities. Barzillai, the Gileadite, comes out and gives David all of this food, all of these provisions, and he helps David out. David is able to find help in the most unusual places. And God reminds us of this often in our life, that God brings us help in ways that we never think about. In ways that we never think about. God just comes into our life and says, oh, you were expecting help from here. I'm going to bring help from here. You were expecting to have this happen, but I'm going to bring this into your life and have this happen, and it's going to be much better. God does interesting things like this. Now, the rebellion under Absalom has a much superior force. They have the entire army of Israel on David's side. But they're fighting in the forest of Ephraim, a place where there's lots of ravines, a place where there's lots of trees, a place where a guerrilla army has a much better chance of surviving than allowing Absalom to have all of these massed troops attack him. And David fights on the terrain that suits him. And it says that the forest claimed more lives that day than the sword. When I was reading that, I'm going, ooh, it sounds like the Ents in The Lord of the Rings. You know, they just come after all the orcs and they defeat them all and just destroy them all. I don't know what it means by the forest claim more lives. Did they fall into ravines? Did they get caught in branches and couldn't fight, and therefore David's men just came along and stabbed them? I'm not quite sure what it means. But what I do know it says is that God was fighting for David. God was on David's side, and even the forests come to David's aid. But again, the author is much more interested in Absalom and David than he is in the battle. Absalom dies this really quite gruesome death. He's riding along. He's got a beautiful head of hair. All of you guys with long hair, this is why you should get hair like mine, or like Ben's, or Tom's, or somebody. Here, let's do the old laser thing here again. Can I point out anybody else? Oh, there's Tex. I can get Tex. There he goes. You know, instead of this long flowing hair that you can see on this guy, you need short hair. Because in this battle, he was riding along. his hair gets caught in a tree, and there he hangs. He's not dead, he just can't get loose of all of his hair. Joab finds out about this. Joab brings some spears, runs Absalom through because Joab knows that Absalom needs to die. But Joab is a violent man, and we read about Absalom's violent end. And then its impact on David. You know, this story really leaves us in doubt about whether this was a victory or defeat. David knows that these things are happening because of the sin in his life. And he knows that, yeah, I won the battle, but the battle should never have been fought. I should have never sinned. You know, the consequences of my behavior are continuing on. And if I hadn't sinned, Absalom would never have to die, and we would have never had to fight this battle. And David just views this whole thing as a defeat for him. Joab knows that he needs to tell David that Absalom is dead. And he's got two people that want to volunteer to do, well, one person that wants to volunteer to do this, but Joab says, oh no. You remember what David does to messengers who bring him bad news. I mean, the messenger that showed up and said, oh, Saul is dead, David had him killed. And the messenger that showed up and said that Ishbosheth was dead, David had him killed. You know, don't send anybody you like to go tell David that Absalom is dead. And so he picks this Cushite from another country. He said, hey, you're expendable, we don't like you. You know, go and tell David. But Ahimaaz, I can't even say his name. That guy. He's the son of Zadok. He's an important person. He's the son of an important person. And he really wants to tell David the news. And we spend a lot of time in this chapter just building up the suspense of this story. You know, you have these two guys that are supposed to go tell David. One outruns the other, and the suspense just grows and grows. First, Ahimaaz, I think that's how you say his name, gets there, and David says, is Absalom dead? I don't care if we won the war, is Absalom dead? And Ahimaaz says, I saw great confusion, but I don't know what it was. And really, that's why David had these other people killed, because they had killed the Lord's anointed. This man doesn't claim to have done the evil deed, the deed that he should not have done. He just says, I don't know what happened, I saw a great commotion. So the suspense builds some more. Then the Cushite arrives, and he says, yes, Absalom is dead. And there is no joy in the victory. There is only grief. My son is repeated 5 times here in this chapter, 3 more times in the next chapter. David is just unconsolable in his grief because he knows that he has sinned, and the consequences of that sin is coming to fruition. He knows that his family has sinned, and that is coming home to roost. And all of that comes down on him at the end of this battle. He knows what he has done. He knows that he's forgiven by God. He knows that he's going to heaven, and there's not going to be any punishment in heaven for this. But he knows that the consequences of this have continued. And that saddens him. And it should. But Joab takes the role of the realist, says, David, you can't go on like this. You've got to come out and say thank you to these people that sacrificed their lives, who fought for you in this battle. You have got to come out and say thank you for that, for saving the kingdom. You know, you've got to get off this Absalom thing. He doesn't try to talk him out of his grief. He just says, you have to behave better. Come out and say thank you to the troops. We learn from Absalom that this